You're tuned in to today's Live at 5. Before we jump into today's episode, I just want to remind you that this show is only possible because of the continued support of amazing people like you. You can continue to support us by subscribing to this YouTube channel, sharing an episode with a friend, or signing up to our Patreon page via the link in the description below. From there, you'll be able to access some exclusive bonus content and dive deeper into the world of Live at 5. Now, without any further ado, let's get right into today's show. We hope you enjoy. Hey there, you're listening to Live at 5, and it's Sunday, May 17th. And Darcy, that means only one thing. Can you guess what that is?
No. What is it?
One day until the last two episodes of Last Dance come out. I mean,
of course.
That's what we're all thinking, right? We're thinking, man, I hope we can get this podcast over with so we can go watch our basketball documentary. You know what I mean? How are you doing, Darce?
I'm doing well, man. I enjoyed the intermittent sunshine this afternoon in the park, and ready to have what has to be shaping up to be an amazing conversation over the next hour.
You said it, and we won't be talking about Jordan, Pippen, or Rodman today, but we will be talking about
Horace Grant.
Oh man, is he a bad sport, or is he just like a little bit cool for school?
I like him.
I kind of like him as well. I like all.
I think he's underrated.
You know who I really like is I like Steve Kerr. Like Steve Kerr. He should go into politics. We could really use him. Anyway, we're not talking about that. We're talking about one of the greatest figures in jazz, and also who is Louis Armstrong. We'll just get cats out of the bag. But we're going to be talking to one of my heroes, a guy that I met about 5 years ago when I went to New York with Pete Horsfall, who's if you know Kansas Smitty's, you know Pete Horsfall, incredible trumpet player, incredible knowledge of jazz and all kinds of things like that. And we went to see Ricky Riccardi, who's our guest today. We went to see Ricky out at the Louis Armstrong archive. And we basically, before we knew it, 4 hours had gone by, and he just taught us so much. And we left with just, big smiles on our faces and more knowledge than we could have asked for. So, but before we jump into conversation with Ricky, we're going to play some music. And I was so glad that he said play this, because this is one of the Louis Armstrong videos that always makes my hair stand on end. And this is one of 3 tracks from, I believe, Copenhagen, and we're gonna talk to Ricky about it. So I won't get it wrong. I'll save myself getting it wrong so that he can get it right. And this is Dinah. You're listening to Live at 5.
The next number we're gonna swing for you is one of the good old favorites. That's Dinah. Look out there, boy. Are you ready? Look out. Is anyone finer in the state of Carolina? If there is, then you know, show to me, Dinah, the Dixon blazing, who love the city gazing to the eyes of Dinah Lee. Baby, every man, one eye, shake with fight, cause my dynamite, change your mind, Bobby, don't you want to, don't Dinah, baby, I'll have an original, oh, baby, oh, Dinah, oh, Dinah, oh, baby, Dinah Lee. Oh, baby, every night, so that you want to do that, baby, I'd have an original, yeah. That's all there is. There isn't any more.
Hey there, we're back, and we're back and joined by Ricky Riccardi, who's calling in all the way from, am I right, New Jersey?
Toms River, New Jersey. Yep.
Toms River, New Jersey. Amazing. Amazing to have you on, man. Thanks so much for doing this.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man. So we were just talking a little bit about that video, and can you give us some background on, I know it was in Copenhagen, but what year was it?
That's from October 1933, and it's a super fascinating period. Armstrong goes to England in July of 33. He had been over there in July 32. He spent 4 months, and he always wanted a way back, and he really enjoyed it over there. So his manager, Johnny Collins, books him on a tour. They start heading over on the ship, and they get in a huge fight. And Armstrong and Collins separate. You know, they decide Collins is no longer going to manage him. Collins leaves Armstrong stranded in England, takes his passport with him. And one thing, I've been studying a lot of the melody makers at the time. When Louis first shows up in England, his chops are almost shot. And the critics who had been with him, Percy Brooks and John Hammond and all these guys were there the previous year, Spike Hughes, they're kind of horrified. They think he's doing too much showmanship, too much entertaining. He's not playing enough trumpet. What happened to Louis Armstrong? Even Selmer gets into the act because Armstrong had to rest for a little bit. They put a big ad. Now that Louis Armstrong has rested his chops, you're going to hear him better than ever. So he eventually goes back on the stage, but he needs a manager. And so who does he turn to? Jack Hilton, the great British dance band leader, and who was so instrumental getting Ellington over there a few months early. And so Hilton's the one who books Armstrong on his first Scandinavian tour. And the first stop was Copenhagen. And Armstrong has this band, the Hot Harlem Band, they were called. It's a really interesting band. It's some American musicians like Peter Ducange, the reed man, he was from New Orleans. Oliver Tynes, the drummer, was from New Orleans. Other musicians from Paris, from England, wherever they can find them. And they show up in Copenhagen, and I think 5,000 people were waiting at the train station. And Armstrong was sure that it had to be for somebody else. Maybe there was a famous aviator, a war hero, or president, or somebody on the train. But no, they were all there for him, flowers, the whole thing. And the Danish press, they covered his every move. Even the black press was over there covering it, talking about how people were just getting his autograph, watching him eat breakfast, the whole thing. So coincidentally, they were making this Danish film, which I could not pronounce if you paid me $1,000. But it was kind of a variety, like musical thing, where it was a bunch of comedians and entertainers and this and that. They would go up and just do their number, and there was a really thin plot connecting everything. So they said, hey, we got Louis Armstrong here, could you be in the movie? And so they filmed 3 songs. We just watched Dinah. They also did I Cover the Waterfront and Tiger Rag. And the footage was just buried in Copenhagen for the next 50 years. I don't think it was ever unearthed in Armstrong's lifetime.
Wow.
I think, David Chartock, a famous jazz film historian, he was the one who first brought it to light in the 1970s. And people just lost their minds because the crowd shots are obviously phony. Louis is in the theater, he is on stage, but they're making it look like a live concert. But otherwise, we are there on stage. Is
it? I've always wondered this. Is it dubbed? Because a lot of, the quality, it's not dubbed.
Not dubbed at all. Nope.
Wow.
It's the first appearance. Actually, I shouldn't say that. He had done Shine and I'll Be God Ready to Rescue You in a Rhapsody in Black and Blue, which was in March 32. And some camera angles in that are dubbed, others are live. They had like one camera going live the whole time and the rest were mimed. But this is live audio.
Wow.
They are doing what they do on stage. And so
to put that in perspective for people who don't necessarily check out this era of music very much, to get an undubbed performance of a jazz great like that, that's like ultra HD, Dolby surround level of kind of precision, isn't it?
Yeah, it's insane to knock out 3 numbers like that. And then said for the footage to disappear, then it reappears in the 70s, and now it is kind of held up as the gold standard. Ken Burns uses it, and Lincoln Center, everyone uses it. This is the young genius of Louis Armstrong. And it wasn't until I hate to get my plugs out of the way so soon. I was researching my upcoming book about Armstrong's big band years, that it really dawned on me that this was really one of his most, I mean, his whole career, you could say, is controversial. But in this period, the British critics, the European critics, some of the most racist reviews he received were in Copenhagen. He followed this up in Sweden. They were comparing him to a gorilla. He had already been in England the previous year. They called him an ape and all this kind of stuff. So the dance critics didn't know what to make of him. A lot of the dance band musicians, Melody Maker did a whole piece in 32 where they interviewed all, not even the jazz musicians, a few, but mostly these kind of unknown British dance band musicians, and most of them were horrified. They said, you know, this is something for musicians. This is not for people. You can't put that on the music hall stage. It's barbaric. And so at the time, even the critics who had been worshiping his 1920s records, they're starting to turn on his 1930s records. Leonard Feathers in England, he is hanging out with Armstrong actually a lot right after this concert when he returns to England. And Feathers already be like, you need to hear Louis Earl Hines. The stuff he's doing now it's just showmanship and tricks and high notes, and so already he was getting that stuff. And now, you know, this clip is supposed to be the representative of the pure young Armstrong, but no, to the certain critics and certain musicians at that time, he had already gone commercial. He had already become an entertainer. He was already banished from the jazz kingdom.
Wow, that's so interesting. I mean, we were saying before that on this show we've come up, you know, with Adrian and various other people, we've come up, you know, against that word of entertainment because it is so it's kind of so taboo in the jazz community, because jazz is supposed to be pure and it's supposed to be artistic and it's supposed to be and it should be all those things. And you know, a lot of, you know, great, you know, you think of great art should be that way. But entertainment for a lot of us is not a bad word. And I think this video really brings that to the foreground. Don't you think?
Of course. I mean, yeah, you can just pay attention to the trumpet playing and get so much out of that video. You can transcribe it, you can try to play it, you can quote it, you can analyze it. It's great. But his stage presence, the way he directs the band, he knows that all eyes are on him, the way he turns around, the way he's kind of dancing and bending over and closing his eyes and shaking his head. He is a performer. He is a pop star. He is an entertainer. He is so much more than a jazz musician. And if you're just focused on the trumpet playing and bemoaning everything else, you're missing one of the greatest entertainers of the 20th century. And this is what people don't understand. I teach a lot. I just finished teaching a course at Queens College here, Music of Louis Armstrong grad student course. And the first time I taught that in 2015, I gave some live concert examples from Satchmo Symphony Hall, the 1947 All-Stars concert. And
that's Boston Symphony Hall, right? Boston. That one. Okay. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah.
That one. Yeah.
And the students, they loved the music, but I'll never forget, some of them were just knocked out by the way Armstrong talked to the audience in between songs. Yeah, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. You know, now we're going to lay, whatever it was so natural. It was so relaxed. It was so real. And they were like, you know, they don't teach that. You know, I'm in jazz school now, getting my scales and my theory and my, you know, ensembles and arrangements. I don't know how to talk to an audience. And so that becomes the lost art. And not to get on my soapbox too much, but I have a pet theory that Dizzy Gillespie understood this probably better than anybody on the bop and modern jazz scene. But I think the glow of Charlie Parker and later Miles Davis kind of obscured everything. And so musicians and students follow Bird, they follow Miles, they'll follow Coltrane. Genius musicians, not the greatest showman.
No. It's a shame you're almost not allowed to say that, aren't you? You know, people, you say like,
the whisper. I'm on Zoom and I'm whispering in my bedroom right now.
I remember, you know, when you're talking about hyperbole in jazz criticism, since it's such a small community, I mean, I can even remember, and don't get me wrong, love Ken Burns, love like all of what it's done, the jazz film and all of his productions. But everybody is the greatest, right? In a Ken Burns film. It's like, and actually when you kind of admit like, okay, well, you know, Coltrane wasn't the best showman, or that you know, Parker wasn't the best composer because he only composed over a certain, like, you know, to me it makes them greater, because
Yeah.
it highlights their greatness. You know, it's like actually they didn't do that great, but they were doing this at such a high level that it just made them stratospheric in everything else. So anyway, I just love that you've gone there.
Oh
I'm
man,
with you already.
and it's true. And you know, there are people probably watching this saying, "Who cares?" You know, John Coltrane doesn't need to be a showman. He's out there pouring his soul into his horn. That's what I want to hear. And
Totally.
I say, God bless it. I think that's great. I love Train. I love Bird. I love everybody. But to me, is a more interesting train. And maybe I'm just fixated on trumpeters. I'm not a trumpeter. But if you follow Louis Armstrong to Roy Eldridge to Dizzy Gillespie to Clark Terry, not only do you get every harmonic trick in the book and every tool of how to play swing and bop in every style known to man, but you also get the stage presence. You also get the comedy chops. You also see how they built their sets, how they would do a roaring bop number, follow it. You know, Dizzy might do All You Coo, or Clark Terry might do Mumbles, and then he might do a ballad that everybody knows, then something else where they're flying all over the horn. And then those guys worked until they were in their 70s and their 80s, and they're on the Tonight Show and they're on Letterman, and they never had, you know, Dizzy never had a hit record like Hello Dolly, and yeah, Clark Mumbles was on the radio a little bit, but whatever. But they found out the way to kind of take this music, and Armstrong too, I think it all stems obviously from Armstrong, to play it with no compromises, to be instantly identifiable within like one phrase, and also make it palatable for the public, and you know, giving it in such a way that even the average Joe who might think that, oh, jazz is a bunch of snobs, oh yeah, they're playing, you know, over my head. No, you know, they'll sit there and listen to, you know, Manteca or whatever it is, and you know, be like, oh, this is pretty good, this is great. And so I think those artists should be taught more in jazz education and all, and it's deeper than the notes. You know, learn from their careers, learn how they built a set, learn how they talk to the audience, and maybe you'll be working when you're 70 and 82. Who knows?
Great. Since you brought it up, I mean, I always think of the friction between, you know, the friction between Louis and Dizzy, and you know, you go to that concert that you put up that I just thought was so great. The live in California ones. What is that? The Crescendo Club. You know, that 55. He's having a good night. You know, he's really for me. I was just, and then he does that song. You know, about the beboppers, right? And to me, that's, you know, that's really a low point in the set, because I'm like, come on, this is a cheap shot, you know. But we talked about it, and you said it's definitely in jest, right?
Partially, we should go there, but also I should mention, if you analyze that second set at the Crescendo Club, I think 2 songs later he does 12th Street Rag, which is making fun of corny, quote unquote, Dixieland music, and the band is hamming it up, and they're taking these foolish breaks, and you know, Barney Bigard, you hear him dancing, and they're singing along with the piano player, so they're making fun of, you know, too traditional, they're making fun of too modern. You know, to them, we can get into the stylistic discussion, but it's funny you opened by mentioning The Last Dance. My wife and I are obsessed with that, and we're so every week waiting for the Sunday night episodes, we don't know what to do anymore. So this morning, no joke, this morning, my littlest one had a sleepover by my parents, and my oldest kid's been playing video games all morning. So my wife and I watched an HBO documentary from a number of years ago about Magic Johnson and Larry Bird and their rivalry. And they were talking about how much they kind of hated each other, how competitive they were, but they were also mirror images of each other. You know, to the public, it was, oh, white, black, you know, LA, Boston, whatever this, but the competitive, their backgrounds, everything, they were like the same person, and it kind of like drove the other one crazy. And I think that's what we get when we get to Louis and Dizzy, because you know, musically 2 totally different styles there, obviously, but Dizzy is so outspoken. He is the most outspoken. People always go to Miles. It's hard to find Miles bad-mouthing Armstrong. There's the one passage everybody quotes in his autobiography, which was mostly ghostwritten by Quincy Troupe. But if you look at Miles's Blindfold Test, Miles and Playboy, you know, sometimes you might have something a little vague, but it's usually very complimentary. Dizzy is dropping bombs. You know, Louis is a plantation character. We had to get away from that Uncle Tom beat, you know, 1957, right before Little Rock. He's still referring to him as an Uncle Tom. So with Dizzy, it's personal. The interesting thing is Louis fires back at Bach, but he always excludes Dizzy from the criticism. Every time he will make fun of bop, he will make fun of modern music. He will say, you know, they're not studying the music right. They don't have tones. You know, they're doing this. They're playing for other musicians, but not Dizzy. Yeah, Dizzy is an old fox. Dizzy's smart. And so Louis sees something in Dizzy that, you know, this guy might be giving me hell, but I can't quite return it. And then Dizzy actually kind of instigates that whole quote unquote feud. He records Pop's Confessin' in '52, in which, you know, Joe Carroll does the Armstrong vocal and Dizzy plays like Louis at the end. They're the cadenzas and the whole thing. And so Whiff and Poop song was kind of Louis's reaction to that. And like I said, it's tongue in cheek, but he would, yeah, there's one YouTube video, he did it on TV in '54 where he would wear the red beret and he's, you know, he's getting about flatted fifths and all that stuff. So it's deep there. What happens though is Dizzy moves to Corona, Queens. He moves literally right around the corner from Armstrong. And a few things happen. I mentioned May '57, Dizzy's still calling him an Uncle Tom and Esquire. Then in September '57, Louis puts his whole career on the line, calls the, you know, the government can go to hell and all this stuff over Little Rock. And that really impressed Dizzy. But the two of them, their wives used to be dancers and they became quite close, quite friendly. And so Louis and Dizzy begin hanging out more in Queens. And that's when Dizzy has the big revelation, like, oh boy, I screwed up here. This guy that I thought was just laughing and smiling on stage to make some white people happy, he's doing it for me. And when we're alone in our den. And Dizzy writes in his autobiography about how as a young man, he completely misjudged Armstrong. And he said that smile that, you know, gave me and so many of my generation trouble, that smile was Louis Armstrong's refusal to let anything take away his joy of performing. That man had been through hell and racial incidents and you name it, he experienced it. But when he was on that stage, you were getting he was going to give you the time of his life. And it took Dizzy a long time. And I've realized that you can kind of put the camps of people who had problems at Armstrong. One camp are people who actually met him and experienced him and hung out with him and they loved him. And that's Dizzy. Dexter Gordon, I'm quite friendly with Maxine Gordon, Dexter's widow, and she tells stories of Dexter threatening to fight musicians. And I won't name the musicians because she won't name them, but in the 1970s, I'm talking pioneers of bop. If they said something negative about Louis Armstrong, Dexter was ready to fight them. Jackie Byard has a beautiful quote about being invited to a recording session. He said he was the most natural man I've ever met in my life. Just to see him talking, he said, brought tears to my eyes because he was so natural. But then there were people who never got backstage. And I'll call their name. John Lewis, the Modern Jazz Quartet. You know, he gave interviews in the 60s. You see Louis Armstrong on stage jumping around. That's not real. That's not who he is. He's just doing that to make. And so it becomes this thing where if you only know the stage Armstrong, you might immediately think, well, that's got to be fake. No one's like that. No one smiles and mugs and, you know, he's just doing that because he's pandering and it's making me uncomfortable. But then those modern musicians who made it backstage, got to hang with him, got to be backstage, got to be in his dressing room, got to invited to his house in Queens. They realized, nope, this man is he's
totally genuine.
Yeah, I think Arvell Shaw said it. Oh no, Ossie Davis said he became an angelic presence after he spent some time with him backstage.
Wow. So in reference to the Dizzy thing, you know, because one of the things that I always think about is that, and it was funny, you know, Spotify does amazing things sometimes. I don't know if you've seen that Verve Complete Roy Eldridge thing.
Oh yeah.
You listen to that and Roy Eldridge is so indebted to the playing of Louis Armstrong, not necessarily the theater of it. And I feel like what you're describing is that actually Dizzy was kind of offended by the theater, not by the playing, because obviously first comes Louis to Roy Eldridge, and then from Roy Eldridge, the next one is Dizzy. That's so it. You know, I mean, what about that era of guys? You know, your Roy Eldridges, your Charlie Shavers, your Sweet Edisons, your Buck Claytons. They must have. Where were they?
Yeah, no, that's Louis's biggest, you could say, period of influence. All those guys come out of Armstrong.
And that's 30s, right?
That's the 1930s, yeah. And this is another thing I'm leaning on pretty heavily in my next book. I will never say anything bad about the Hot Fives and Hot Sevens. Sometimes people say to me, oh, yeah, you don't like the Hot Fives. And it's like, no, it's not that. Do I think they've been maybe overinflated a bit? I do, because when they came out in the mid 20s, those records were race records. They were aimed in urban communities, and some of them did better than others. But let's not, this was not the pop music of the day. It was the Paul Whiteman and Guy Lombardo and people like that. And it really wasn't until they were reissued in the 1940s that all of a sudden a lot of people said, "Oh my God, look at that! Lewis was playing like what we're playing." We had no idea. In 1929, OK Records switches Armstrong from the race label to the pop label, and all of a sudden he's got the big band, and they're giving him the songs of the day. So if OK has recorded, Cliff Edwards doing "I Can't Give You Anything But Love," now they're going to have Armstrong do it. If Segarellas did "Ain't Misbehaving," we're going to get Armstrong's version. If Rudy Valley did "I'm Confessing," now we're going to get Armstrong's version. And so in this period between 29 and 32, you can check the charts in Variety. He is the best-selling artist on the label, and this is as a pop musician. Columbia Records, 1932, best-selling artist. All of Me goes #1. All these records, "Love You Funny Thing," "New Tiger Rag," "You Can Depend on Me," and he is, taking the white pop scene and standing it on its head. Injecting something that's undeniably, unapologetically black and totally Louis Armstrong, and swinging it and doing everything he's doing. And those are the records, I think, between 29 and 33 that the world hears. And those musicians you mentioned, Buck Clayton talks about hearing Armstrong in California in 1930, and Roy sees him at the Lafayette Theater in March 32, and Teddy Buckner hears him in California. Cootie Williams sees him in Harlem in 29. His first night in New York in March 29, there's interviews from musicians who were there when he played the Savoy with Louis Russell's big band, and he mentions, he goes, "We remembered Lewis when he was here with Fletcher Henderson." He goes, "But then we kind of forgot about him." And then this was an interview with Phil Schaap, who's talking to I think Garvin Bushnell, and Bushnell said, because we weren't really following the Hot Fives or Hot Sevens, because it wasn't until he came back in 29 that he became a god. And so that's the period. And everybody you mentioned, you can't get them to say a bad word about Armstrong. But to me, I think the most interesting thing, his disciples hear him, they come right out of him, and they all go their own way stylistically. And it's really interesting. It's almost more of the black disciples go their own way. A lot of the white disciples, Harry James, Bunny Berrigan, Armstrong is front and center in every note they play, Bobby Hackett. But a lot of the black disciples, they start off with Armstrong. They could always fall back there. But when it's Roy Eldridge, when it's Sweets Edison, when it's Buck Clayton, when it's Red Allen. And they all have
Jonah Jones. You mentioned to me one time,
God,
right?
Jonah.
You turned me on to him, actually.
Oh God, you listened to him with Stuff Smith or with Cab and all this. I mean, this stuff is phenomenal. So there is that generation there, and they never really lost it. There's I think Stanley Dance or Steve Vost. Steve Vost had an article in the 60s about being backstage at a concert, and someone mentioned Armstrong's Confessin'. And he said all the musicians, and it was like Benny Carter and Roy Eldridge and Vic, all the musicians sang Armstrong solo. And it was like, 37 years later. And they had the whole thing memorized. So I do think the period of Armstrong's biggest influence in terms of just changing the sound of music, pop music, jazz music, musicians, concepts, singing, the whole thing, is this 29 to 33 period. And I think that's the period that people still sleep on after all these years. Which
man.
Crazy.
Wow. That's so cool. So we're going to jump into some more music from, this is from a different period, I think, right? So much great stuff. You're listening to Live at 5 with special guest Ricky Riccardi. This is some more music from Louis Armstrong, but we'll be back with more in a minute. And we're back live at 5 with Ricky Riccardi. I mean, we're just smiling ear to ear here, man. I can't get enough. So I have a question for you about that video in particular. You know, Trummy Young and Louis have this special thing with arrangements, and you'll listen to the same tune, you know, the year after, or 3 years after. La Vie en Rose is a perfect example, and they'll have this beautiful head arrangement on it. You know, how did they come up with that stuff? Was it ever written down?
Never written down. Nope, never written down once. But there's an interview from 1950 that I might reference a few times where Louis really kind of gets down and dirty talking about music. And he talks about how the best part of playing this music, he said, is remembering things. And he said, you know, other bands might have arrangements. He goes, but they don't have the arrangements we have. And then he, you know, pointed to his head. And it's fascinating. You listen to Muskrat Ramble on Satchmo Symphony Hall. The routines there, the ensemble choruses, the stop time trombone thing, even the solo order, we're going piano, bass, clarinet, second clarinet chorus, we're going to get some background riffs, okay. But you also hear it's so alive. You know, Louis and Teagarden are kind of setting these riffs behind Barney Bigard, but they're not quite in sync. And you know, Teagarden's listening to Louis, and you know, at the end, Louis comes in with this triumphant phrase, and everybody's kind of just going for themselves. And it's like, yeah, this is live jazz. Oh boy, this is exciting. You listen to the version on Ambassador Satch from '55, the routine is the same, but now the background riffs, or the crescendo version, the background riffs are solid. Trumming is going to quote Down by the Riverside, and the band's going to sing it. There's going to be this quote.
Right. Yeah.
One thing after another. Louis is now going to come in with that same, you know, opening phrase, bum, 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 but now the trombone is going to echo it, and then the clarinet's going to echo it. And, you know, the drum hits are going to come in that last break, bum, 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 the triplets. And so it's now an arrangement. And this drives, you know, a lot of traditional jazz critics crazy, because they want Bunk Johnson out there, you know, just, you know, playing, you know, from the heart, and we're just going to improvise, and this is the way it used to be done. But Louis is, yeah, he has moved well past that.
Well, yeah, well, exactly. I mean, this was a question that I had for you. It's you know, we were talking about the, you know, the various disciples of Louis Armstrong, but then there are the people who grew up playing trumpet and grew up playing jazz in New Orleans around the same time as him, and then didn't leave and didn't become, you know, international, you know, superstars. You know, Bunk Johnson being one of them. Of course, then later you have, you know, Kid Howard, Alvin Alcorn, you know, these kinds of people that I think are incredible, and they're really playing New Orleans jazz, you know. And well, I mean, they're playing the post-original Dixieland Jazz Band New Orleans jazz without the violin and without. But you know, it's rough and ready. It's a little bit slower at times. It's and like you said, you know, the parts are really improvised, and it's kind of out of that parade tradition. How did Louis look at that? You know, what did he take from that? Or
yeah, I mean, Louis always had a soft spot for that music, and you know, his record collection has Bunk Johnson, has Turk Murphy, you know, Eddie Condon. So he listened to the traditional music. Anytime he was played that stuff in blindfold tests, he usually appreciated it. I know when he heard Paul Barberin's Atlantic album, he complimented John Brunius, the great trumpeter. But a lot of the musicians who just stuck in that style and didn't really move, it almost sounds cruel, but he thought they were stuck in a rut. That's the phrase he used. So I might let me see how my brain forms what I'm about to say, because this is important. And again, plugs, but this is kind of the underlying current of the next book. You know, Louis leaves New Orleans, goes to King Oliver. They keep that New Orleans tradition going, 2 cornets, ensemble. But then he leaves Oliver, and he pretty much leaves the world of small group ensemble, you know, polyphonic playing for the next 23 years. You know, the Hot 5 and Hot 7, it's a recording band. That's, you know, about a couple of dozen days over a 3-year period of Louis Armstrong's life. Meanwhile, nightly, he's playing with Fletcher Henderson. Then he goes back to Chicago. He's playing with Erskine Tate. Then he's playing with Carol Dickerson. He's playing with Sammy Stewart. Then he takes over Carol Dickerson's band. Now he's a band leader. And whether he's fronting Louis Russell's band or the Castle, or the Coconut Grove band, or, you know, Les Heights band in California, he is playing big band music. He's the featured soloist playing arrangements. and the world is with him. The swing era, finally blows up in the mid 30s based on everything he laid down. By the late 30s, though, there is this rumbling going on underneath. You have the hot clubs are starting to meet, and they're finding all these 1920s unissued recordings, and they're listening to Armstrong play with the Hot Five, and they're comparing what they're hearing on Decca records as they're going, something sounds different there. He sounded a little more pure and this and that. And so they start going to the record labels, it's George Avakian and Milt Gabler, and organizing these reissues. And all of a sudden there's a rediscovery in the 1920s music. And now there is an audience for it. It comes out in 1939 called Jasmine that blows up. And that book is the one that really rediscovers Bunk Johnson, and now Bunk Johnson becomes a folk hero. They dig him out of New Iberia, Louisiana, buy him a new set of, now we're gonna, now we're gonna hear it.
And a bottle of whiskey.
Yeah, a bottle of whiskey. That's a good name out. And so Bunk Johnson is now held up, and you read these traditional jazz Bibles in the 40s, like the Record Changer and all these magazines. Oh my God!
Because they decided that he was the link to Buddy Bolden, right?
He's the link to Buddy Bolden, and he is the link to a pure, unvarnished, untainted by commercialism, music. And so when Bunk comes to New York in the mid 40s, every magazine, not just jazz magazine, Look magazine, Esquire magazine, Life magazine, they're all there. It's like an event. This old man is showing us the roots. And the traditional jazz Bibles, they're doing victory laps, and they're getting digs in at Louis. Like Louis could take a few lessons from our boy. So that's all happening. Meanwhile, Louis is really paying no mind. He loves Bunk. He invites Bunk to sit in with his big band in 1941. They share the stage at an Esquire date in 45. But he's moving on. He gives an interview with Leonard Feather in 45 because some people want me to omit arrangements. He said, people who say that, I say omit those people. He said, to be honest, because the music that they used to play, because I can play that with one finger right now because we've progressed, and this is where it's at.
But isn't that amazing that that's the same language that bebop uses, and then it's funny. I think jazz has changed in that way, in that we're all so much more aware of what came before because of the way that media is kind of, transmitted now, that we think twice before we say things like that, hopefully.
But the mid 40s, it becomes the jazz wars, and it's really a critics thing. The musicians don't get too deep into it. Like I said, Louis and Dizzy kind of become the figureheads for this feud, but otherwise it's the critics. And so you get the stylistic thing. George Avakian, who was like a grandfather to me, and he records the first jazz album, 1939, Chicago Jazz. Okay, so now that's a style. Chicago Jazz. What are we talking about? Well, it kind of looks like a New Orleans band with a trumpet, trombone, and clarinet, but it's got a more swing and rhythm section and more solos and some backing riffs. And hey, they might play Embraceable You or something like that.
Right.
But that's Chicago Jazz. Then Decca follows that up.
Embraceable You, for those of you listening, was a pop tune in 1939. That has to be made clear. It's not Down by the Riverside. It's not Make Me a Pallet on the Floor.
And that's the New Orleans thing. So now there's the New Orleans revival, and so they get Bunk and George Lewis and Baby Dodds, and they are playing those songs. They are playing spirituals and things like that. And then that leads to the West Coast scene. A lot of white musicians, Lou Waters, Turk Murphy, they're copying the records. Like King Oliver's band, 1922, Baby Dodds didn't use a woodblock at the Lincoln Gardens, but he had to use it in the studio. But now these 1940s, they're using the woodblock because they want to make it sound just like the record.
Like the record. Wow, that's so incredible.
Oh my God, Baby Dodds, the physicality of his playing, he's all over the set. It sounds like a rock and roll drummer sometimes. But
the one that's great, that's been reissued on vinyl, and I don't know if it's you would know better than me, but is that Jazz a la Creole, which if people are into this sort of music, it's just such a great way to hear Baby Dodds play, because he's all over it and it sounds good. It's like a good high fidelity thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, like you said, the technological limits of the medium kind of dictated then how people interpreted it. Just the same as 3-minute sides. It was like songs didn't necessarily last for 3 minutes, right?
No, especially you hear these Lincoln Garden stories. They would go on and on, chorus after chorus. Or Lewis talks about playing a Wild Man blues, and Johnny Dodds would take up such a long solo. He would go in the back and have spaghetti, and before the solo ended. So, but back to these critics, and now you have the Chicago style here. That's and they write the parameters. That's what must happen. And like I said, Eddie Condon might be like, I want to record "Embraceable You." I want to record "When Your Lover Is Gone." Oh, what are you doing? New Orleans, George Lewis is quoting, Woody Herman solos, and he records Sinatra's what is it? This Love of Mine, and Bunk. This is all album. Bunk Johnson plays popular songs, In the Gloaming and stuff like that.
The one that they cover that always knocks me out is "Over the Waves," which is the Barnum and Bailey theme song. It's like
exactly
it doesn't get much more pop than that.
No, the musicians, I think, had bigger tastes. And, even the George Lewis band, you follow them in the 50s, they love those Armstrong decades. They're doing Coconut Island. They're doing Darling Nellie Gray and stuff like that. But the people, and I love these people like Bill Russell and George Avaki. And it's like, no, we want you to be authentic. We want more Buckets Got a Hole in It. We want more blues, and we want to hear that. So, okay, that's all happening. Then bebop blows up. And so now there's the critics who hear Dizzy Gillespie at the Spotlight, and then go across the street or in Midtown Manhattan and hear Bunk Johnson at the Stuyvesant, and it's like, oh my God, two totally different styles, but two rabid audiences. The Bunk Johnson fans are screaming, "Make me a pallet on the floor," and Dizzy's fans are cheering him on for Hot House or whatever. And so naturally, the critics now fall into those camps. Well, Dizzy is the only real music. You don't listen to that old-fashioned shit. And then the old-fashioned people, the moldy figs, jazz never got any better than Bunk Johnson. These records from 1944 are the greatest records ever. So that's all blowing up in the 40s. And so
in New York or in all like.
That's like the jazz world. Yeah, the jazz world kind of splinters into all this stuff. And so a few things happen. Where is Louis Armstrong during all this? He is still leading his big band. There's the recording band, so he doesn't record much, but what he does record in the mid-40s becomes hits. He does a cover of the R&B ballad "I Wonder." He records his first duets with Ella Fitzgerald, and "You Won't Be Satisfied." But meanwhile, he's playing Broadway. He's playing the big clubs. He's playing for troops. He's covering. We only know this because acetate discs have been discovered in recent years. He's playing As Time Goes By, and I Couldn't Sleep a Wink Last Night, and A Pretty Girl Is Like a Melody. So he's still doing pop songs with arrangements featuring himself. But the jazz world now thinks of him in with these certain lights. So 1945, there's an Esquire concert, the second Esquire concert, and they had like a New Orleans section. Then they had the modern day section with Duke Ellington and Benny Goodman and Sid Catlett and Billie Holiday. And of course, they put Armstrong in the New Orleans section with Sidney Bechet and James B. Johnson and then Paul Barber and J.C. Higginbotham. And we're like, wow, that's great. What an all-star band. At the time, he had just recorded the song "I Wonder," which was an R&B ballad, becomes a hit. He's on a review on Broadway with Bill Bojangles Robinson and all these great African-American entertainers, a top review at Zanzibar, all this kind of stuff. And now he has to go back and play, quote unquote, this old-fashioned stuff. Wow. And of course, him and Bechet can't be in the same room. So they're fighting with each other at the rehearsal. If you listen to the broadcast, Lewis won't let Bechet solo. Every time Bechet starts the solo, Lewis plays right over him. But he's getting a little pissy.
I think you showed us one of those where there's a break or something where it's just like it's like a car crash. It's like nope, you will not be playing there.
Lewis plays a break on "I'm Confessing," and Bechet, it's the most sarcastic two notes I've ever heard. It's like, woo!
just talking to each other.
Exactly. So Armstrong does not want to be pushed in that box. But meanwhile, bop is blowing up, and his first opinions on bop are very complimentary. He records the song "Snafu" by Neil Hefti in '46. That's kind of has its toes in the. Leonard Feather wrote "Snafu." Neil Hefti also plays trumpet on it, but it dips his toe in the bop waters. But he also realizes that that's not music for the general public either. So he has no interest. And even stylistically, by the mid-40s, he is so into his tone and the upper register and the sound and holding notes that playing a lot of notes. He always said he did that in 1918. So bop has no appeal to him. Meanwhile, the black audience, they basically abandon jazz. They see all this fighting and they can't dance to bebop, and they're not interested in Bunk Johnson. they go straight for R&B.
To Louis Jordan. Yeah, exactly.
And, everything going on there, Wynonie Harris and all this stuff. And, another one of my pet theories, but I always think, the history of jazz, you always take it in school. And it's like, when New Orleans goes to the swing era and the swing era goes to bop, and then we've got cool jazz and, and hard bop and free jazz and avant-garde. There's a much more interesting history of music to be written. Like, where does the Black audience go and where do they always go dancing? And so you can go swing era, bop, to R&B and Louis Jordan, then to rock and roll and Little Richard, then to James Brown, then to Ray Charles and Sly and the Family Stone. And you go that way, and everything almost looks more connected than it does in the jazz or by avant-garde. What's the relation between this and
wow,
and
man.
I know we're running out of time, but
no, this is great.
To end my theory, though, 1947, Louis is at a crossroads. The big bands are just dying. He appears in this terrible movie called New Orleans, and he plays with a small group, and so the Moldy Figs are foaming at the mouth, like, oh, that's what we want there. And it's like, what does he choose to do? What does he choose? He decides to form a small group, integrated small group from day one, trumpet, trombone, clarinet, front line. So the Moldy Figs and New Orleans folks and Chicago folks, they all throw up a cheer. But the rhythm section is going to swing like it's 1947. You've got Arvell Shaw and originally Dick Carey, Earl Hines, either on piano, and then Sid Catlett on drums, who's on a lot of those early Bird and Diz records.
Super modern drummer, yeah.
Oh, dropping bombs on Muskrat Ramble and all this stuff. And so they go out, and now Armstrong has been used to, this is another thing I didn't really realize until I began the research. In the big band era, we just think, these big bands were just playing for dancers every night, and jazz was America's popular music, and everything was, a dream. Louis traveled with a review. He had a male vocalist who did the love songs. He had a female vocalist who did love songs, no duets or anything. He had comedians. He would have dancers, And
what era is this? Which era are you talking about?
35 to 47, right?
Okay. So it was a full entertainment show. You were getting the whole right. Okay.
His last big band gig at the Apollo, he had Slim and Sweets doing the Romeo and Juliet routine, and Leslie Scott singing Sinatra, and Velma Middleton doing this before a lot of her stuff. She was doing straight pop songs. So he breaks all of that up, gets rid of the review, and becomes like the one-man review. So when you look at an all-stars list,
right.
Even he'll do Muskrat Ramble, but he'll say, now for all the musicians in the house. And then he'll follow that with La Vie en Rose and become the crooner. And then follow that with, the Whiff and Poof song, or That's My Desire. Now he's the comedian. And then Velma might dance. So now you're getting your dancing. And he talks about this in that 1950 interview that, this is a man who saw jazz move from the speakeasies to nightclubs and dance halls and this and that. Now he's mostly playing concerts. He's looking out there every night, 2.5 hours. There's an audience just staring at him. He knows he can't just play 10-minute jam sessions on Lady.
Sure.
That's
a real, what you said, it's a real distinction, from those guys that were really working in the swing era, is that they were jobbers. That's what we say over here, that they played jobs, and Louis played more jobs than anybody, right? He was just with everybody. And then to be in in a 20-year period, to then be in front of an exclusively listening audience, it's you see it in a different way.
Totally. And this is again where the jazz people missed the boat. I've had students say it, I mentioned that song Snafu. They hear Snafu from 46. They're like, I wish Louis did more of that. I wish he just played a little more bop or a little more hard bop or did something. Yeah, that would have been great. But he gives all these interviews in 48 where he is like, George Simon mentions Armstrong has tears in his eyes, talking about the music business and how much that him and his generation fought to kind of get this music accepted. And now a bunch of young musicians were playing for other musicians. And he's like, the gigs are going to dry up. The audience isn't going to be there. You have to remember, you have to play something that the people can hum, all this kind of stuff. And so it's interesting that he actually navigates it. and follows the trends of pop music. So by the early 50s, pre-rock and roll, there's all these terrible, Patty, no, I shouldn't say terrible, Patty Page and all these kind of vanilla singers. He's having the biggest hits of his career at that point with Blueberry Hill and La Vie en Rose and A Kiss to Build a Dream On. The mid-50s rock and roll comes out. He's like, all right, I'll get a heavier drummer, Barrett Deems, will play a little more backbeat, and I'm going to have a hit with Mac the Knife, and I'm going to have, Satch Plays Fats is going to become a #1 jazz album. The 60s, he's knocking off the Beatles with Hello Dolly. He's knocking off the Rolling Stones with What a Wonderful World. And there was an article 2 years ago from a jazz writer writing about that, saying by the 1960s, Armstrong had clearly lost touch because when you look at his songs like Hello Dolly and What a Wonderful World, it's like, lost touch to who? Yeah, he's not
right. Yeah,
Stone off the charts in his 60s, and because he's not playing with Art Blakey, or he's not playing A Love Supreme. He's lost touch.
Right.
It's incredible that he's able to tailor his music, find out what's going on, what the public wants, and always remain himself. Whether he's recording with Dave Brubeck or the Dukes of Dixieland or the All-Stars or Ella Fitzgerald or Oscar Peterson or Oliver Nelson, he is always himself. You know who he is in one note, one syllable. And to have that kind of career, and always, just to this day, 6 million listens a month on Spotify and all this kind of stuff. You just can't find it. Yet he's not really. Yeah, it's all you and me combined.
I just play it on repeat. No.
He's not really taught in jazz school or as part of the jazz curriculum. They teach that he is the father and he did West End blues, and we should respect that. But my students I just finished, they love the stuff from the 50s and the 60s, and even the Oliver Nelson stuff right in 1970. And it's just like, there's so much that we still need to wrap our heads around. It's been 50 years almost since he's gone, and we're still learning what exactly he represented and what we can learn from him as musicians, as humans.
Yeah, there's so much innovation in all of those periods that you just have to discover it. You actually have to listen to the records and not just decide that the answer. Because I feel like when what you've shown me, and also just discovering, talking to Pete, Adrian, all the guys in Smitty's, various other people, he was so prolific that he could really be in one mood one day and another the next, and you hear, like you said, within one concert you might get 6 different moods,
and something for everybody. Whoever's in that audience, whether it's somebody seeing him for the first time, somebody seeing him for the 10th time, a professional musician, an old lady, whatever it is, someone who only knows the pop records, they're all going to go home smiling, and they all got something. It's really just the stupid jazz world and the stupid jazz critics.
Well,
like, I heard him play Indiana last month, and I don't want to hear this again. It's like,
yeah. Well, let me ask you another, because we were talking about this before we got started. I don't want to keep you super long, but I do want to ask you a couple more questions.
Yeah.
So, going back to that, the period that you're focusing on, obviously you have the one book out already that is What a Wonderful World, and that's from 47 until the end of Lewis's life, right? Okay. And when's the new one coming out?
Next one is going to be called Heart Full of Rhythm. It'll be out in the States in September and the UK in November. And it's called Heart Full of Rhythm, The Big Band Years of Louis Armstrong. And that's him arriving in New York in 29, and it goes right to 47. So those two books, I never envisioned writing it backwards like this, but they'll actually intertwine once they're both out.
Yeah, perfect. It's like it'll be our Lord of the Rings. This is the the extended edition. But so we were talking a little bit, in that period, Louis spends that year with Fletcher Henderson, and you're saying that's right around the time of the Hot Fives, and I was reading your blog, which also, we're going to drop a link to that in the description. For all of you listening, please check the links in our description below, subscribe to this channel, do all that wonderful stuff. It helps us out a lot. But Ricky's blog is an amazing spot for more of this kind of chat. But I love that you've done the 6 minutes of Satch stuff. I think that's just so cool. And you had the one with McKinney's Cotton Pickers, and then the one I was reading today is the Tiger Rag one, where he's in Paris, right? And you were saying that the chop problems thing, and I found this record that I have. I didn't because you.
That's it.
That's the one.
That's the one.
And they have the Super Tiger Rag. And anyway, you all can go read the blog post. But I found a few years ago, I was digging through Coleman Hawkins records. And of course, Coleman Hawkins is on a kind of a similar journey. You know, he starts out, he does his Fletcher Henderson thing. He's with Fletcher Henderson up until the early 30s. And then he goes to Europe for a little bit longer than Armstrong, right? And I'm sure you've heard this, but I found this recording of him playing Tiger Rag in Europe in the 30s. And he's pulling out all the Louis Armstrong licks. He's doing the ba-ba-dee-doo-doo-dee, with the shake and everything.
Yep.
And I thought, this is really interesting because Coleman Hawkins, comes from that same period of, Louis Armstrong has a massive impact on him in terms of his soloing after the Fletcher Henderson thing, year. And then he's really massively indebted to Louis Armstrong, obviously does Body and Soul, and the beboppers love him, right?
Yeah.
And he falls in love with them, and he becomes this kind of almost the Bunk Johnson figure to the beboppers, yeah. if you can generalize like that. I know it's totally different. Coleman Hawkins is this intellectual player of so many amazing phrases, and not to take anything away from him, but how did they relate over their careers? Because they must have run into each other a lot, and obviously they're around the same age, right? What's that relationship like?
Complex.
Okay.
Very complex. I've heard different things from different sides. In my upcoming book, I kind of set up Hawkins not as a major antagonist, but a little bit, and I'll explain that. Because when Armstrong comes to Henderson's band, you hear the pre-Armstrong records. It's a fine early 20s dance band, and Hawkins sounds pretty good. He's got like the slap tongue thing going and all that stuff. But Louis comes in, and every time he takes a solo, it's a totally different band. Like I've always said, like the sunshine coming through the clouds. And it takes Hawkins a while, but Hawkins himself admitted it. He said one night they just let the band loose, and Louis played Tiger Rag at the Roseland Ballroom. And Hawkins said, I watched him, and I thought to myself, could I ever attain that level of greatness? So yeah, so Louis has an impact. And by the time he leaves the band, he's only there for 13 months. The whole band sound has changed. Don Redman's arrangements are changed. They're doing things like TNT and Sugarfoot Stomp. Hawkins has changed, but Louis is never really happy. For the rest of his life, he always kind of has mixed feelings about that band. And really what it comes down to is these were a lot of the more snooty, you could say intellectual East Coast types. And from day one, when they saw him, they heard the way he talked, they looked at his fashion, everything else. They all kind of turned their nose up in the air. And he won their respect with his playing, but he never really got buddy with too many of them. And I'm allowed to curse on this thing. Am I allowed to curse on this thing?
Say what you want.
Okay, yeah, because I'm quoting Louis Armstrong.
As long as it's not about my mom.
Was she in Fletcher Henderson's band in 1920?
I don't think so, but I'll ask her.
Louis' phrase he used about the whole band was a bunch of big-headed motherfuckers. So,
wow, right.
And he said that they never took it seriously like he did, and people would make mistakes in the band, and nobody really cared. And when it was time for a break, they would all just disappear and drink and smoke and talk to women. And Louis would stay around and listen to the other bands. And he mentions hearing Red Nichols and hearing B.A. Rolfe and Vic D'Ippolito and all these other, mostly white dance band musicians come in. And he was just, so influenced by them. And so the other thing, though, Henderson never lets Armstrong sing. Which to the day he died, Armstrong never really wanted to be a leader in that regard, but he said that Henderson had $1 million talent in his band, and all he had to do was feature him a few times, let him sing, let him take some longer solos. Said he would never do it. He thought that Louis's, his stage presence, his voice, everything else would not go with Henderson's kind of upscale clientele. So Louis is frustrated, and Lil Hardin, they were still married at the time. Lil is the one who kind of gets him out of there and brings him back to Chicago, bills him as the world's greatest cornet player, and sets him on his path. So with Hawkins now, Hawkins is, musically right on par with Armstrong. There's very few in that period. Sidney Bechet, Earl Hines, Hawkins. But Hawkins is like the anti-Louis Armstrong in terms of showmanship and singing and stage presence and what you have to do. So to bring Cootie Williams in, Cootie Williams joins Henderson in early 29 before he joins Duke. And Cootie Williams said that Williams was obsessed with Armstrong, but he said anytime you mentioned Armstrong, Hawkins would just sneer. And he goes, I didn't know at the time. He goes, but Coleman hated Louis. And that's the way Cootie put it. So flash to 1934 now. So we watched Dinah early on. That was October 33. I mentioned Jack Hilton's book in Lewis. By Christmas 33, Lewis is at the Holborn Empire, and a chunk of meat, as he put it, blows out of his lips, and blood runs down his shirt. And the audience in England starts, throwing coins on stage and basically boos him off the stage. It really kind of was one of the low points of his career. He needs to stop playing for a month. So now he's kind of just like hanging around, living in London in 34. And Jack Hilton makes a big announcement that he's bringing Coleman Hawkins over. And without telling Lewis and without telling without telling Hawkins, Hilton and the Melody Maker go ahead and announce, we're going to do a concert in April for the musicians of England with Louis Armstrong's band and Coleman Hawkins. Well, they tell Lewis, and Lewis is like, fine. And Lewis actually sends Hawk a very complimentary telegram. But then they tell Hawkins, and Hawkins is like, whatever. And so Hawkins arrives. Lewis has his tenor player actually transcribe some of Hawkins's features. And Lewis is trying to get a date with Hawkins so they can rehearse. And Hawkins won't rehearse. He's like, I'm busy today, maybe next week. Now see with me and all this stuff. So finally, Lewis is like, screw it. And he cancels the concert. And the Melody Maker loses their mind. And Percy Brooks goes after Armstrong, writes this giant thing there about, I've never seen such a, spoiled artistic temperament. Lewis was afraid that Hawkins was going to show him up, and he knew that his band was inferior, and so he pulled the plug at the last minute. And he kept saying, it's not going to do me any good, but we'll never forget this. And so the Melody Maker totally turns on Armstrong. They become Hawkins' biggest champions. Armstrong, though, gives his side to other outlets and tells him that I am not going to go on that stage unprepared. We rehearse, we have his arrangements, we've tried finding his keys, he wouldn't meet with me, so I don't have time for this. So that's 34. And so Hawkins stays, doesn't come back home until 39. So after that is where you kind of get the split, where Hawkins actually has a jukebox hit with Body and Soul, a record where it's instrumental.
Just got lucky, basically, right? I mean, it's just
plays the melody, and to like the jazz people, that's like the hallelujah moment. Like, see that it can happen. You don't need to sing, you don't need to be a showman, you don't need to be an entertainer. You could actually get accepted by just playing a beautiful improvised saxophone solo. And so this begins the split of Armstrong and Hawkins. And by 44, there's the first Esquire concert where Hawkins and Roy Eldridge sound super comfortable. They're playing like Oscar Pettiford's for Bass Faces Only, and they're taking chorus after chorus on I Got Rhythm. Lewis, he was battling kidney stones that night, so that's one excuse. But Lewis, Jack Teagarden, they don't sound as comfortable. So I think being there, Hawkins is now totally embracing the youth movement. And by the following month, February 44, he's recording, quote unquote, the first bebop records. So just to hit the fast forward button, you follow Lewis's career, in 47, Lewis is recording songs from the movie New Orleans with Kid Ory and all this stuff. And they put it out, Louis Armstrong and this Dixieland, Hot 7, blah, blah, blah. And Hawkins is also recording for RCA label, but he's putting out records with Fats Navarro and stuff like that.
Right.
And Hawkins, you could follow him until the end, whether it's Monk, whether it's his album with Ellington or Rollins or whatever else. He is so almost pathologically petrified of being pegged as an older musician or playing an older style. He wants to be up to the minute, up to date, hanging with the cats, right until the very end of his life. And so to me, I think Hawkins actually embodies the spirit, quote unquote, of a jazz musician more than Armstrong does. I think what people think of as what's a jazz musician, what's taught in jazz education, what's taught in jazz school, that's more Hawkins, because Hawkins is there for every stylistic change. He's, again, instantly identifiable. He has a hit record. He plays with small groups, big bands, pushing himself. I mean, he could record a Monk and then record with Red Allen, and do that kind of stuff. So Hawkins is on that path, and I think that's why he doesn't get the worldwide fame, but in the jazz world, his jazz credentials are impeccable. But Armstrong never viewed music that way. I think there's two different ways. There's more than two ways to view music. And why do you do this? Why do you do it for a living? Why choose to play music? What are you trying to get out of it? And to Armstrong, I mean, growing up in New Orleans, not knowing where his next meal was coming from, music was a way of survival. It was a way to get food on the table. It was a way to have something stable that he didn't need to worry about stealing or anything else like that. There was no such, didn't even use the word jazz when he was coming up in New Orleans. This was just dance music. And Armstrong said all the bands he played with, Fate Marable, all this stuff, they were playing waltzes and rumbas and foxtrots and all different styles and all different everything. So Armstrong always has that kind of, liberal view of music of, you're not going to put me in one style. I'm going to play all kinds of music. I'm going to make sure the audience is happy. I'm going to be a great comedian. He learned so much comedy on the stage. And so what Armstrong's doing, to go back to our initial conversation, is, he is more of the entertainer. And people will have fist fights over what is more valid, entertainer or the artist, blah, blah, blah. And I think Armstrong, though, is the perfect combination of both worlds. I don't think you could find anybody else who is a peerless artist and a peerless entertainer. And I think Armstrong and Hawkins respected and admired each other and coexisted, but also two different mindsets about what they wanted to get out of their careers.
Yeah. Well, man, I could talk to you for days, but I'm going to let you go. And I just want to say that the record of the day is one that you told me once was your Bible, but I'm sure you have a lot of Bibles. But this is definitely a Bible for the Kansas Smitty's crew, and it's Louis Armstrong Plays W.C. Handy, which is just one of the greatest things. We could do a whole episode on that, and hopefully at some point we could.
Good segue, because I'm working with the good people at Mosaic Records right now, and actually we were in the studio last fall. The liner notes have been submitted. We just got approval from Sony on Friday. And it looks like this fall, I'm hoping, I've predicted this a few times, but COVID-19 had other plans. This fall, we're putting out a 7 CD box set, the complete studio recordings of Louis Armstrong for Columbia and RCA Victor between 1946 and 66. And wow. It'll have a lot of the great singles, a lot of big band sides, aside from the movie New Orleans, of the Mac the Knife session. But the big blowout, 5 discs will be devoted to Handy, Satch Plays Fats, and The Real Ambassadors with Dave Brubeck. In each case, we're putting out the album, which is about 47, 48 minutes, followed by about 80 to 100 minutes of alternate takes and rehearsals and breakdowns and stuff that will just blow your mind. I don't think I've ever been so proud of a set, and wow, I can't wait for the light of day. But yeah, everything is just about done, and we hope to have it out this fall. But yeah,
you have people listening out there. You have about 5 months to buy another CD player. Yes. Get your CD players now while they're discounted, because exactly. when that set drops, man, those CD players are going to go through the roof.
We're going to revive the CD industry. I will say the last Mosaic set we did was the live one, Live All Stars with Columbia and RCA Victor, and that was a 9 CD set. But that went out of print after about 3 years, and almost like the month after it went out of print, it went right on Spotify. So I think there must be some clause in there that Spotify can't stream it while Mosaic is selling it. But if you're patient, I think it'll all eventually get in the streaming world out there.
Amazing, man. Ricky, thank you so much. It's just been just great. And for those of you listening, we're changing up the Live at 5 schedule next week, which is super exciting. We're going to be doing 3 days a week with live music from our studio at Memrise HQ. So we'll be in the studio Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, but we'll still be bringing you our Archive at 5 live music program on Friday and Saturday with a dose of Time for a Tipple from our head bartender, Alex Bolton. So, Ricky, again, man, thank you. And let's do it again.
This was a ball.
Thanks, man.
Anytime.
Cool. All right. Good night, everyone. And we'll see you tomorrow live at 5. Thanks again. Thanks again for listening to Live at 5. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel to stay up to date with every episode. You can also click on the link in the description below to sign up to our Patreon and find out where you can sign up for Kansas Smitty's memberships, as well as purchase records and merch. Enjoy your evening, and we'll see you tomorrow, live at 5.